It's very good. And the forthcoming book, Reassessing the Book of Mormon. I might also mention Morgan has several blogs, including one on Book of Mormon warfare, which you ought to ask him about. It has some very good insights into the Book of Mormon. He taught history at Brigham Young University, Idaho, and has been accepted into the War Studies PhD program at King's College, London, studying the early insurgency of Mao Zedong. He and his daughter live in Las Vegas. The title of his presentation today is Climbing a Tree to Find a Fish, Insurgency in the Book of Mormon.
The bandits in the Book of Mormon often capture the imagination of the readers. Starting to kill political leaders from the shadow, they spread throughout the land using unknown code words until they defy entire armies and obliterate nations. The vast majority of literature on the topic focuses on their secrecy. When I was in high school, my CES instructor compared them to the mafia. Some bloggers compared them to Marxist figures or linked them to various conspiracy theories, and their practice of war has been compared to other secular insurgencies. Another scholar has linked them to a cult of war and classic Mesoamerican history. Kelly Ward and John Welch have noticed the Hebrew legal distinction between thieves and robbers that the Book of Mormon demonstrates. These are all thought-provoking studies with a great deal of merit, yet I think we can dive even deeper into the text. The various historical uses of the term robber applied to the Book of Mormon suggest that the Gadianton robbers contributed to and resulted from the weakening government control. From the weakening government control over its territories and as a backlash to the unintended side effects of Nephite policies, and arose because of the powerful message of the robbers. These causes also serve to highlight the loaded nature of the term robber and the ethnic distinctions within Nephite society. There are obvious applications of the word robber where wealth or property is transferred through an unlawful use of force. Yet oftentimes the only difference between the lawful appropriation of taxes, and unlawful plunder is the subjective legitimacy of the government. This is why the use of robbers in other sources is so illuminating. The rise of robbers corresponds to a sustained period of Nephite political weakness that allowed them to flourish. While the political chaos and military conflict is hardly unique to the Book of Mormon, a rise in robbers does correlate to a set of interrelated factors visible in ancient societies. This includes a failure to control the capital city and governor from foreign enemies, a failure of government officials to effectively enforce its laws, and an inability of the government to maintain territorial integrity. It is safe to say that the Nephites were not doing well during the periods of the books of Helaman and 3rd Nephi. Mormon first introduces the Gadianton robbers in Helaman chapter 1. The chapter started with a detailed political dispute between leading sons. After the dispute is settled, perhaps through unrighteous means, as I'll explain later, the group that lost assassinated the chief judge. His successor, the chief judge, then witnessed a speedy invasion from the Lamanites and died trying to flee. These couple of years in Nephite history inaugurate almost 100 years of chaos, military defeat, and political intrigue. During the period, the Nephite leaders are increasingly unable to enforce their laws. For a while, it seems the robbers administer laws without the knowledge or consent of the central government. A short time after the political maneuvers in Helaman chapter 1, Nephite, the chief judge, is forced out of his position. In the 7th chapter of Helaman, Mormon cites the sadness of Nephi as he returned to the land of his nativity, only to find that the Gadianton robbers have taken the power of the government. Using language one would expect from seeing others take control of the government, Mormon says they did not enforce Nephite laws and standards. The most intriguing verse which supports Nephite political impotence is found in Helaman 11:8. After the punishments of God are inflicted upon the people, we read, "And the people began to plead with their chief judges and leaders that they would say unto Nephi, Behold, we know that thou art a man of God, and therefore cry unto the Lord our God that he turn away from us this famine, lest all the words which thou hast spoken concerning our destruction be fulfilled. And it came to pass that the judges did say unto Nephi, according to the words which they had desired." So if this was one nation, it's rather odd that Nephi had to be reached through a third party. Why couldn't the people talk to Nephi themselves? Mesoamerica often consisted of rival city-states, somewhat similar in size and political activity to ancient Greece. For example, anthropologist John Sorensen described one Lamanite king as having powers limited at best. When the king worked to remove Ammon's brothers from prison, the king still had to personally visit another king to gain their release. Moreover, by this period, Nephi had already been attacked by mobs in unfriendly Nephite cities and had to be carried by the Spirit to a safe location. On top of Nephi being so removed from the people that the Nephites had to reach him through an intermediary, later in the history, the believers who traditionally wielded a great deal of political and spiritual power as the high priests and chief judges had their execution day set by non-believers. All these examples support the assertion that the Nephites and Nephite elites were politically weak in this period. In addition to Helaman chapter 1, the Nephites faced other losses of territory and an utterly impotent military. As a result of contentions, many settlers left for the far north. This pattern was repeated by separatists that later toppled the Nephite government. In Helaman 4, the Nephites lost all of their territory to the Lamanites, with only a part of it being recovered. Their territory was only fully recovered through a spiritual conversion of the Lamanites. The Nephites were mauled in either small groups in Helaman 124 or in trying to fight the robbers in their hideouts. And the robbers were only defeated when the Nephites consolidated their power in a narrow region. The Nephite political situation both contributed to and resulted from the many new autonomous local actors. The Gadianton robbers started by making pacts to enhance their connection with the government. Hence their connections within the government. There were countless dissensions in the land. Many people joined the robbers within 1 year. They openly operated against Nephite laws. They seduced the majority of the people and took control of the government. At least 4 times the robbers were declared dead, only to reappear in the same chapter a few verses later. A particularly noteworthy scripture helps amplify the results of an increasingly weak central government. We read in Helaman 6:21 that the Nephites did unite with those bands of robbers and did enter into a covenant, and did enter into their covenants and their oaths that they would protect and preserve one another in whatsoever difficult circumstances they should be placed, that they should not suffer for their murders and their plundering and their stealings. All this so far sounds like a straightforward case. Mormon recorded that the chief sin of the robbers was getting gain, and the spiritual sermons in this section of the text often focused on heavenly treasure and humility during times of prosperity. The robbers were so prevalent that they were said to subsist on plunder, robbing, and murder, which largely parallels the accounts given by ancient historians. The Nephites were politically weak and needed a great deal of reminding and repenting, but they did, and their peace and prosperity and destruction of the bandits is recorded over and over. So at this point, most people would begin the usual hunt for comparisons, but not yet. The situation was more complex than the typical image of marauding bands of ruffians among the mostly occasionally righteous but still weak Nephites. We must consider the culpability of the Nephite government in creating the bandits in the first place. The unintended consequences of the Great War, specifically the heavy armor needed for victory and the need for protection in times of political weakness, are the 2 of the major items that created the robbers. In my second book, Evil Gangs and Starving Widows, Reassessing the Book of Mormon, I looked at 4 major actions by Moroni during the war chapters that decisively changed the outcome of the war. The chapter detailed a variety of consequences from the war that actually weakened Nephite society. Things like heavy armor and fortifications required more money. More money meant more taxes, and rapacious taxation easily fuels an insurgency. I use the unique reading of verses such as Helaman 4:12 to show that getting gain in the book of Helaman in the unrighteousness of Nephite society could refer to unscrupulous tax collectors. I point out how military gains usually require military expenditures to keep. The focus on heavy infantry and fortifications required decisive battles, and Moroni's strategy could have seemed incredibly bloody and sanguine. In short, I look at the political fragmentation, desire for money, insurgency, and the weak army in Book of Helaman, and see a straight line from the military innovations by Moroni. Edward Luttwak described the potentially devastating consequences of victory very well. With victory, all of the Army's habits, procedures, structural arrangements, tactics, and methods will indiscriminately be confirmed as valid or even brilliant, including those that were positively harmful, but with all of their harm concealed by the undissected experience of success. Modern American readers, particularly those that are right-leaning, follow Moroni's words with intense devotion. Of course, he was praised by Mormon as a man who could shake hell, so that is understandable. But shaking hell doesn't mean that every action was correct or that his correct actions didn't have negative, unintended consequences. I still chuckle, for example, at Jana Reese's description of him as a military stud muffin. I can only imagine the shadow that his policies cast on contemporary Nephite leaders. But it's still a sad fact that the political fragmentation in Helaman resulted from the activities of Moroni that won the war. Let us consider the issue of heavy armor, for example. Armor is expensive. Ancient kingdoms needed sources of metal, the infrastructure to mine, transport, smelt, and forge it, and a government powerful enough to extract the necessary taxes and labor to support that system. In short, the Nephite armies under Moroni became more expensive, harder to equip, and required a more powerful and intrusive government to produce it. The Lamanites, with a much bigger army, followed suit, which must have drastically increased the cost of their regional wars. As the cost of raising and fielding armies became more expensive, it requires a bigger tax base or more plundering to pay for it. Either way, I'm sure the people felt the effects of the massive transfer of wealth needed to equip these armies. The effects of massive new taxes either angered the people against the government and perhaps even inspired the insurgency. As the text in the Book of Mormon would say, they were seduced and joined the robbers. The heavier armor also limited their tactical and strategic mobility. In places like Alma 44, the heavy armor meant that the Nephites had an advantage in shock battle. That is, two infantry forces which charged at each other on a relatively flat battlefield to hack their way to victory. But they became far less able to meet other threats, which relied on mobility and hit-and-run tactics to swarm or exhaust their enemies. This means that the battle-tested, victorious, and more heavily armored Nephite soldiers actually encouraged hit-and-run attacks. For example, in pursuing insurgents into their mountains, wilderness, and secret places, the Nephite army was decidedly less effective to the point of total disaster. This was likely the result of a combination of fatigue from marching in heavy armor to inaccessible locations and the use of hit-and-run tactics in rough terrain. Heavy infantry are also far more effective in mass groups. Thus, without time to arm, equip, and mass their soldiers, a mobile army of Lamanites easily slew the Nephites in small bodies. A central government in need of power not only tries to co-opt local leaders, but also tried to control them. This is a particularly useful explanation explaining why the Gadianton robbers were pronounced dead at least 4 times during Nephite history, only to reappear a short time later. Historically, the chaos that resulted from political weakness resulted in actors that can be divided into 3 camps. The first group is the predatory bandits that fit the traditional image associated with robbers. Yet the second 2, local elites that assume power, and former officials that take advantage of the power vacuum, can assist in our understanding of Nephite society. Roman sources called many groups robbers, but it seems probable that they were actually the private forces of local magnates that were maintaining order and control outside of Roman public authority. Historian David Graff added a similar point from Chinese history. To protect themselves and their communities against the predators, local elites organized their kingsmen and neighbors into militia forces. Many also followed the time-honored response to troubled times and relocated to forts built on hilltops or in other easily defensible locations. One leader of the protective forces was Lu Zushang. He was the son of a dynasty general, and his family was wealthy and locally influential. Though still a teenager, Lu recruited stalwart warriors and pursued the bandits, with the result that they no longer dared to enter his district. He eventually established himself as governor of the province. The first section showed how the central government was increasingly ineffective at protecting its borders. If we read this Chinese example using the language of Book of Mormon editors, we would conclude that these were lower judges in the land who rebelled against central authority by raising their own forces. Again, if we were judging by the usual terms in the Book of Mormon narrative, Lu Zushang was an elite who had money and was inspired by Satan to keep it. Lu Zushang, eventually, he raised his forces so he could more easily fight and maintain his position. Lu Zushang fighting other robbers would possibly relate to verses like Helaman 11:2 that refers to a conflict but didn't really reference any Nephite armies. And that's because the central Nephite powers were not involved, but it was simply a contention, according to the Book of Mormon text, among robbers. Any destruction that Lu caused against his legitimate enemies, or even the taxation after he became governor, could be described as plundering and robbing by those that didn't recognize his authority. I only include a retranslation of this example from Chinese history to show how the dominant narrative and language used affects how we view the robbers. The rise of robbers in history wasn't necessarily from a wicked desire to plunder, but from a need for protection using military force. As predatory bandits gained more power, the peasants sought protection from those with the means to provide it, local elites and increasingly autonomous government officials. After all, earlier in their history, the Gadianton robbers relocated to the more settled parts of the land. But they weren't known to the central government, which suggests local governors appreciated or made peace with the added power players. With many Nephites being killed in small groups, many cities being laid waste, 5 chief judges being assassinated, not to mention 3 different prophets, both Nephi's and Samuel the Lamanite, being spared violent deaths only through a heavenly spiritual intervention, higher taxes to pay for more expensive armies, and so much carnage created by those armies, it is little wonder that the Gadianton robbers held such seductive power over the average Nephite citizen. We can see the spiritual message against greed and plunder, but we can also be a bit more charitable and less dogmatic than the record and recognize that the difficult situation that the majority of people were actually in. This doesn't excuse any of their actual wickedness, but it does give additional conflict and suggests how the people only became robbers in the sense that they raised their own forces without authorization from the government. While any military force outside of the central government could be termed as robbers, they are both predatory and protective and possess varying degrees of legitimacy. It is clear that the record denies them legitimacy, but they would have hardly attracted so many people without the negative consequences of Nephite policies such as political weakness, more expensive warfare, and high taxation. The final section tries to reconstruct the Gadianton ideology. We are lucky that we have a long direct quote in the form of a letter from Gadianton, but we also have various summaries of their arguments and inferences we can make on the text. We can also use the best tools of historians to aid in this process. One of the widest beliefs held about robbers is something called the social bandit. This is a figure that achieves a charismatic and legendary status of Robin Hood. While the theory is heavily laden with Marxist thought, and ironically enough, maybe an ahistorical construction, it still provides a useful analytical tool in this case. Not to mention, it might explain why you tend to see all those annoying hipsters wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. The social bandit is somebody who operates on the margins of society and outside the law, but becomes a legendary, heroic, and romantic embodiment of resistance against an oppressive and exploitive government. Robin Hood is probably the most well-known example of this phenomenon, though every society has them. Mormon recorded the audience reaction in front of Nephi in Helaman 8, 5, and 6. These politicians and members of the Gadianton robbers were simply a group dedicated to preserving the greatness and power of their cities and judges. And at this point, you can insert your own Trump joke. There's no discussion of means by which they tried to do this, but this isn't necessarily a horrible goal in itself. It's somewhat akin to modern members saying they want a strong military. Allowing for the fact that Gadianton might have been lying, in his letter he stressed their goals were a more egalitarian society. They promised not to enslave the Nephites, but become partners of all their substance. It's always been traditional to reject his words outright as easily as Laconius did, but there's evidence that the Gadianton robbers were really just seeking land reform. At the end of this phase of conflict in 3 Nephi 6:3, the peace treaty specifically included land reform. And Nephite leaders granted unto those robbers who had entered into a covenant to keep the peace lands according to their numbers, that they might have with their labors wherewith to subsist upon, and thus they did establish peace in all the land. Now, to me, that's a rather odd peace treaty. If we take a straightforward reading of the text, the Gadianton robbers revolt for no good reason beyond being influenced by the devil and having a lust for money and mayhem. And when they are defeated in an epic battle, they get more land, or at least lands. And the next verse described the equity and justice of the peace, which at least infers that those qualities were lacking in Nephite laws and might have inspired the insurgency in the first place. Moreover, Gadianton's letter in 3 Nephi 3 also seemed comparatively respectful of Nephite religion, praising their support of what Nephites think is their God. Compare his relatively respectful praise for Nephite religion with Mormon's comments on the Gadianton ideology. Mormon and Alma went to great lengths to deny the Gadianton robbers and rival religions much legitimacy at all, and spent a great deal of time calling them agents of Satan. Likewise, if we compare his letter to the one sent by Moroni to Ammoron, we find that only one of the individuals threatened genocide, called his opponent a child of hell, and rejected the terms that he originally proposed. It was the robber who was relatively respectful of opposing beliefs, made an explicit denial of any attempt at slavery, and seemed to try and prevent conflict. Of course, his letter could have been pure hot air, and he fully intended on slaughtering and enslaving the Nephites. But we have a somewhat detailed case study of how the Gadianton robbers ruled, and it suggests that he wasn't full of hot air. Where the Gadianton robbers did obtain sole management of the government in Helaman 6:39, they were described in the worst terms. They did no justice in the land. They punished the poor because they were poor and allowed the rich to go free so they could go on whoremongering and killing. Yet one of the few detailed examples we have is actually fairly just. After Nephi prophesied of the murder of another chief judge, he was arrested as part of the conspiracy. They managed to arrest Nephi, an extremely vocal critic of the government, conduct an investigation, and then release him without any indication from the record that he was mistreated. Nephi didn't have his land seized, like the Nephites did to the Lamanites in Alma 50, as he apparently maintained his residence in the capital. He wasn't indefinitely detained before finally being executed, like the Nephites did to their vocal critics during the Great War. Despite being a vociferous critic of what he saw as an evil government, inspired by Satan, Nephi received a fair amount of what we would call due process. Of course, Nephi's son did have his execution date set, and as a leader of a major or dominant religion, Nephi may have been too big to jail. Yet this example is still an illustration of what we might infer about the Gadianton government. Moreover, we can infer even more wickedness from Nephite leaders than the Gadianton ones. Nephite leaders preemptively seized a perceived threat against the government in Helaman 1, where the person's sole crime seemed to be just thinking about flattering the people. that could have seemed like a decent reaction based on the chaos caused by other dissenters. But even King Mosiah had to plead to the people that they had no right to destroy his son should Aaron reassert his right to the throne and spark a civil war. So it seems like a pretty common response from the Nephites that even applied to repentant missionaries. Reading John Welch's legal cases in the Book of Mormon shows us that Alma the Younger had to be very creative in his sentence and execution of Nehor, which only inflamed sectarian conflict. There are many more examples we can infer about the injustice of the Nephites. Daniel Belknap, for example, in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, wrote a very good article detailing the strife and stumbling block that the unrighteous and unjust actions of Nephites caused in the 18th year of the reign of the judges. Considering the rarity of righteous Nephite leaders and the frequency with which they are killed in the books of Helaman and 3rd Nephi, it's more likely that Lyconius and Gidgiddoni had to be cunning and cagey in assuming and keeping power. After all, Amalickiah used extensive maneuvers to gain power in Alma 47, but there are suggestions that even righteous Nephites could have used questionable methods to keep power. Helaman's servant stabbed an assassin after nighttime spying in Helaman 2:6. Nephi exposed another killer in Helaman 9:6. Lawyers and leaders within the Nephite nation were known to beat confessions out of criminals, and both Lamanites and Nephites attempted to poison each other with wine. Of course, the beatings to get confessions were committed by unrighteous figures from the city of Ammonihah, though it's important to note that no beatings were recorded during the period the robbers had sole management of the government. The Nephites even tested the wine on their prisoners first. Gaining and keeping power in Nephite society required significant cunning and craftiness from even righteous leaders. So as the robber Gadianton said in his letter, perhaps he did have many wrongs committed against him by the Nephites. Jailing the prophet for a bit in connection to a murder that he just predicted hardly seems like the government of Satan and seems comparatively better than some of the actions by righteous figures. This, of course, is on top of the rhetoric that says robbers only wanted to keep their country great and the peace treaty that implied they were fighting for land reform. We shouldn't be shocked that perhaps the ugly edges of their character features were omitted from the record in order to better serve Mormon's spiritual message. If we can accept that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young had significant faults, and the leaders of ancient Israel descended to levels of wickedness worse than their neighbors, we should be willing to consider that the Nephite chief judges would have done things that we consider immoral and would have fueled the Gadianton robber status as social bandits among the people. Or in short, maybe Gadianton was closer to Robin Hood, and maybe Nephi closer to the Sheriff of Nottingham than we normally consider. These are tough arguments to make, but arguments that need to be examined if we are to understand why the Gadianton threat represented a historical insurgency that was so pervasive and long-lasting. They had a commanding ideology based on Nephite mistakes and a seductive narrative at least partly legitimized by the same mistakes. Mostly we've discussed political matters, and before we move to the application of these ideas, we must consider why the identification of robbers became so difficult and how it represented ethnic identification. The chaotic scene of political weakness isn't the only reason why the Gadianton robbers are both hard to identify and often sprout from nowhere or disappear just as quickly throughout the record. The utter dismissal of robbers' complaints could indicate an attempt to delegitimize those outside normal power structures and also those of different ethnicities. The transformation of the Chinese figure from robber to legitimate governor reinforces the loaded nature of the term and its use as an ethnic pejorative. As John Shai and Thomas Collier wrote in Makers of Modern Strategy, words, ideas, and perceptions have played an exceptionally important role in revolutionary warfare, and the language is politically hyperbolic and hypersensitive. Revolutionary soldiers are often called bandits, in effect denying them legitimacy, and their supporters described as criminals or traitors, or maybe agents of Satan. Government forces become fascist, corrupt, or a puppet regime. In revolutionary war, there can be no neutral, apolitical vocabulary. Words themselves are weapons. Language is used to isolate and confuse enemies, rally and motivate friends, and enlist the support of wavering bystanders. In short, then, the identification of robbers is hard because the competing ideologies also fought over the words. With the use of words as weapons, the robbers can be dismissed by Laconius as mere robbers. It's probably why authors of the Book of Mormon often compared them to Satan, a marginalized group that had legitimate complaints about Nephite injustice is much harder to address. As much as we love the Book of Mormon and its spiritual message, if we accept the text as describing a real people that existed in history, they would have the same ethnic chauvinism of other ancient societies. The British historian Gildas called robbers a hive of bees and describes their influence as an infestation. The late Roman historian Ammonius called them serpents that come out of their holes in spring to attack with wicked and most cruel fury. And you might also see the title of my book in there, but anyway. And this is compared to Mormon, who calls the Lamanites lazy, and Nephi, who described those who did not believe as dark and loathsome. I messed up on that in practice too. Mormon recounted how Nephi was pushed out of power, not to ineffective leadership, as indicated by the entire sanguine section of Nephite history, but rather because of the people's wickedness. And any migration from the land was not due to Nephite wickedness or the undesirable political climate, but contention from wickedness. During the period of greatest threat from Gadianton robbers, the Christian Lamanites joined the Nephite people, and suddenly their ethnic curse disappeared. We see plainly that the Nephite record keepers used historical ethnic stereotypes against the robbers and Lamanites. Finally, some critics contend that the Book of Mormon does not mention other races or civilizations. As described in the preceding paragraph, I think they're self-evident in the form of Gadianton robbers. I'm not the first to have pointed out hints at different races and cultures in the book. I think I am the first to show by the use of robbers' loaded language and by the weakening of the Nephite central government, it's increasingly possible that the Gadianton robbers were the description of a new ethnic group entering Nephite lands, changing their culture, mingling with the Nephites, and acquiring territory. They had their own powerful message, fueled by Nephite political mistakes. This study should help us see how to apply the Book of Mormon in the political realm. We might better understand that words like terrorism are used as weapons that obscure an attack as much as they clarify. I've written and published about insurgencies from a half dozen different time periods, including the sub-Roman era, the Chinese period of disunion, evil gangs of samurai from medieval Japan, irregular warfare in the American Civil War, and the Chinese Civil War between communists and nationalists. I haven't included a great deal of specific comparisons because I think there's enough material with just analysis from the scriptures, and the wide-ranging comparisons in such a brief presentation would have brought baggage that had taken too long to unpack. But there is always next year, I suppose. In every period I researched, I found the use of the term robber or bandit connoted specific differences in power between the central government and the perceived illegitimacy of new actors and centers of power. As a result, this led to use of words that were far more emotional than accurate. We see the potency of words today as well. Policymakers debate over whether to call anti-American forces in Iraq insurgents or terrorists. In truth, it was a complex mixture of both. Many Americans felt a great deal of frustration when the sectarian conflict in Iraq was labeled the demoralizing term civil war. It explained why the surge led by General Petraeus was labeled an escalation by some critics who were trying to invoke the ghoul of Vietnam. A blockade during the Cuban Missile Crisis would have been an act of war, but a quarantine of the island prescribed the same action without the accompanying baggage. In the prelude to the Bosnia deployment, each side for and against that deployment avoided the term genocide to evade the treaty obligations associated with it. Most people who accuse the Bundys of terrorism do so utterly unaware of the long history of using words as weapons. I certainly disagreed with their actions, but I was even more bothered by the casual use of emotionally charged words based upon political inclinations more than clinical definitions. As I discussed above, when the language is weaponized, it's a scary sign leading towards revolution. I hope we can use terms that are clinically precise and avoid needless bomb throwing when discussing sensitive issues, like actual bomb throwing. Speaking of being clinically precise, it's very popular to repeat the cliche that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. In the sense that words themselves are weapons, this is entirely true. Various revolutionary groups, terrorists, and governments that oppose them can use the terms to either boast on their position or undermine their opponents. Yet despite the manipulation of words, and despite some of the disputes over the definition of terrorism, it's still entirely possible to tell the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist. Items such as donning of uniforms, discrimination between military and non-military targets, discernment against or deliberately targeting of civilians, and declarations of war from recognized heads of state make it very easy to distinguish between George Washington and Abu al-Baghdadi. There is some overlap between insurgents and terrorism, but it's not nearly so indistinguishable as the purveyors of the cliché would lead you to believe. So I hope we will avoid the use of tired cliches whose users only have an appearance of scholarship while denying the power thereof. The most important lesson might be how we notice and apply the unintended consequences of the Nephites in regards to foreign policy. Not intervening in Syria was at least partly based on the belief in blowback, that American actions can cause even bigger problems down the road. But inaction has consequences as well. The most militant fighter survived. The chaos invited radical terrorists who consolidated control. The internally displaced persons and flood of refugees destabilized neighboring countries, and the victories of ISIS inspire lone terrorists around the world. If both action and inaction can have severe consequences, we must use as many examples and as much insight as possible when making a decision. One of my most disheartening moments came when I had reviewed a great book about just war. It's actually back on the Greg Crawford book table called Even Unto Bloodshed. The author I reviewed did a great job of challenging the complex web of preconceptions that we bring to reading the scriptures and its guidance concerning warfare. These preconceptions cause us to normally just seek shallow proof texts instead of having the scriptures challenge and enlarge our understanding. It was sad to review a book that did so much to challenge my preconceived notions and almost immediately get a copy and pasted list of proof texts in response, or a rehashing of pre-Iraq invasion arguments. Hopefully this presentation provided information that can challenge understanding and produce new insights. Hopefully these insights can help a person better decide the course of American foreign policy, the missions the U.S. military should adopt, the funding they should have, and the politicians at the ballot box that most closely align with your view. This approach should help how we read the Book of Mormon. If the Book of Mormon is a historical account of real people, then their decisions should reveal the same bias, weaknesses, and disputes as other historical events. Upon closer examination, we do see that. Looking at the way the Nephites caused, or at least contributed heavily to their banditry problem, we might see how even the best policies have unintended consequences. And at other times, they weren't good policies at all, but we were diverted by the narrative without seeing those mistakes. If we do see them, it will bring a new understanding of the text, just as the mature faith that members are beginning to develop for the flawed, loved, complex, sometimes grossly mistaken, but still inspired 19th century church leaders like Brigham Young. The idea of the social bandit might help us recognize those that are at the margins of Book of Mormon history. I love military history and reading about battles, but there's much more to the struggle than arrows on a map or some vague comparisons to the mob or communists. Even though there are specific chapters about the humble and poor, I don't see a great deal about the disenfranchised, a great deal of research about the disenfranchised, the dispossessed, and the treatment of ethnic others. I think that it's perhaps because they were labeled as evil in such stark terms that we haven't looked. We can understand and value the spiritual message about Satan's temptation, but we might also consider the alternative causes of revolt. We might also be inspired to look beyond the rhetoric at the marginalized people around us. For example, we might consider how even basic matters like church policy have unintentionally hurt our brothers and sisters in the gospel. They aren't necessarily wicked for feeling like a new policy has rejected their children. I find that in the church, most of our preaching is about how bad a sin is. And during my more snarky moods, I picture a conversation somebody might have with the bishop going something like, well, I sinned because I just never heard that one talk about pornography. In my life, I've tried to really understand why people do the things they do. The vast majority of sin doesn't come from a lack of knowledge, but from something else. As I often say, it's a heart problem, not a head problem. People are hurting, frail, angry, carnal, and ultimately fallen. I think more often than not, most people need a hug much more than another sermon. They don't need another lecture about Satan's temptations, but they need a true friend with a shoulder to lean on. The topic of insurgency can be difficult to study. That one worked, finally. Alma actually forbade a discussion of them, so much of the information is actually obscured. But assuming we had no more, we would run into similar difficulties in debates regarding how legitimate new actors are and what their message is, which is further hampered by the use of emotionally charged and stigmatizing words. Indeed, even with a good deal of education and access to the news, not even including life or death matters like debate over foreign policy, even when the church buys a few yards of public sidewalk, it creates intense debate and fierce difference in analysis. We can see that a sustained period of political weakness from the Nephites allowed the insurgency to grow. This insurgency was enhanced through the unintended consequences of Nephite policies, ranging from the use of heavy armor to tax collectors and the probable rise of protective groups of robbers. The Gadianton robbers were possibly fueled by a social bandit ideology that found righteousness in their quest for land reform, justice, and equity. The confusion over terms, various causes of insurgency, and a potent ideology are some of the reasons that Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek said that trying to fight an insurgency or even understand one was like climbing a tree to find a fish. Hopefully the next time you read the text or have a discussion of robbers within the Book of Mormon, must articulate a position on foreign policy, or maybe see an emotionally charged word being thrown around carelessly, you'll have better tools to respond. Thank you. Thanks so much. All right, 3 minutes. Yes, I see so. Oh, sorry, I should read the question. Yes, that's it. Do you feel that this is literally what's being seen today? There is a great deal of local variation, which is why sometimes this can get complicated, and I can do a 40-minute presentation on just one part of insurgency, the causes mainly. But I definitely see it today. I wish I could have included more modern examples. For example, like using insurgents against insurgents is a very common practice, something that we saw in Iraq with the use of the Sunni Triangle, Anbar Awakening. Sorry if that's too quick. I've got like 3 minutes. Oh, good point. I addressed this in my chapter. What evidence is there that the Nephites were using heavy metal armor? Which, good use of heavy metal. I like that. This is something I address in my chapter. I probably spend about 5 or 10 pages addressing this. The way I describe this, there's obviously a little bit of confusion over how heavy this is because the text doesn't exactly describe how many pounds it is. I base my analysis on the effect, and the effect was only semi-occasionally were they wounded, while in contrast, the Lamanites' exposed skin were wounded a lot. It was decisive in making the Lamanites retreat. It was decisive in making the Lamanites also adopt it. So for those reasons, I describe it as heavy, even though, as the question points out, exactly how much metal or exactly how heavy it is still very much in dispute. That was a great question. So, and it gave me another plug for my book, so yay. This one was just about the same. So I applied what evidence is there for smelting. Of course, that goes into the same gap that there is. I was talking about ancient societies using it. Maybe I got a little applied too much from my analysis of other societies to the Book of Mormon. That's just the gray area that you have when studying the Book of Mormon and only have so many verses about warfare. But whoever asked that, I'd be happy to discuss it with you, and it would make my chapter stronger. I could send it to you if you want. Oh, that's a good question. Do you feel that the compilers of the Book of Mormon were mistaken in labeling the robbers as evil? That's a good question. I would say they were correct, except that terms that, this is tough to describe, especially when I've got like 1 minute left. I think words come with baggage, and they were correct in describing them as evil, but I think the baggage obscures so much more that's in the text, and so much more that we're missing. So much more that we're not looking at. And I can, as I was giving that answer, I thought of 3 or 4 examples in the text. The peace treaty that the Gadianton robbers had, like a peace treaty that you get land is for me, that's like a neon sign of like there was some sort of injustice they were fighting for. Land reform is huge, especially in the communist insurgency. They even have like specific Chinese phrases for them that are really fun to say, like evil landlords and upright gentry and all sorts of things. So, you know, I think when we start to treat the Book of Mormon as history and not a spiritual message, I think we can find various nuance, and it's not just they're evil, end of story. I think it's these guys were killing, a lot of them, there's a lot of killing going on, there's a lot of plunder, a lot of stealing. As I said, sometimes stealing is just is based on how legitimate you think the government is. So, you know, was a governor stealing? Well, in a lot of historical cases, it just depends on who you ask. So Mormon and Moroni with a spiritual message obviously think a lot of things are evil, and as we look at the historical items, it's not as black or white. Was that satisfying? If you don't like that answer, you can come talk to me. I'd love to explain it more to you. I've got two more. Are you okay if I... Quick? Okay. If I can read this one. I can't read that one, I'm sorry. Good. This is a great question. It's about basically, is the Book of Mormon unreliable if it's making social commentary about its day and it's really biased? Is it really reliable? Yes, and that's why we have training for historians, is to how to use and value a source, even though analyzing the source can get a little messy and you might see the flaws in its writers. And I hope that answers the question too. If any of you didn't like my answers, feel free to come talk to me. I'd love to hear from it.
I think it shows it's an authentic book.
Yes, and it even shows it's authentic because they have the same problems as other historians and ancient writers did. Great point.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for letting me have that extra time.